Hey, I'm Org, and in this video I'm going to review the Japanese Tier 5 carrier, the Zuiho. This is a very powerful light carrier that kind of outclasses its opponents at this tier. The Zuiho and Shoho, the two carriers in this class, are a bit odd historically. Like a number of odd naval endeavours of the 1930s, they are the result of the treaties of London and Washington. These were agreements between the major naval powers that limited the tonnage classes and power of ships in their various fleets. These deals meant that the Japanese Navy could only have 60% of the maximum tonnage that the United States and British Navy could have in ships. Unfortunately, Japan thought that they would need a more favourable ratio to be competitive with the United States Navy. In particular, they thought 70% was what they needed. Japan would eventually pull out of the agreement in the late 1930s, despite the fact that admirals like Yamamoto were rightly saying that it was actually to Japan's benefit to stay in the treaties. But before they pulled out, they tried a few ideas to get around the treaty restrictions. The Zuiho class was one of these, as was the Ryujo, the Tier 6 Japanese carrier. The idea behind the Zuiho class was that they were not actually aircraft carriers. They were designed and started construction as submarine support ships, which, just coincidentally, could be easily converted into an aircraft carrier or an oil tanker, should the need arise. The Japanese therefore did not have to count these two submarine support ships against their aircraft carrier tonnage limit. However, the Japanese pulled out of these agreements while these ships were being built, so the Zuiho was converted to an aircraft carrier immediately after launch and was completed in 1940. The Shoho served as a submarine support ship briefly under the name Tsurugizaki until it was taken out of service and converted in 1941 and then returned to the fleet in 1942 as an aircraft carrier. The aircraft that equipped the Zuiho and wood warships almost certainly did not operate on the Zuihos in real life. The torpedo bombers, the B-1N and the B-3N, were both early 1930s designs. In fact, the B-3N only made it to prototype stage before the Navy rejected it, despite how cool it actually looks. The A-4N was a formidable fighter that will be known to World of Warplanes players. It was the last biplane fighter of the Japanese Navy, but had almost certainly been phased out of service by 1940 when the Zuiho entered service. The Zuiho participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, although not directly, like the Hosho. It was in the back protecting the battleships. The Shoho would actually be the first ship in this class to see real combat. Soon after entering service, it was sent on a mission to transport some fighter planes to Truk, which is in the southeast Pacific, north of Guadalcanal, or north of the Solomon Islands. The mission accomplished, it was assigned to support the invasion force heading for Port Moresby. That's in Papua New Guinea, by the way. Because of the aircraft shortages that, well, it had originally been sent to the region to help solve the aircraft shortages they were having in that area, there wasn't actually enough aircraft to put a full complement on the Shoho, so it only went out to support the invasion fleet with 4 A-5M and 8 A-6M fighters and 6 torpedo bombers. Unfortunately, the Shoho was sailing directly into the first carrier versus carrier battle in history, and was doing so without a proper air wing. In the opening stages of the Battle of the Coral Sea, the invasion force was spotted and mistaken for the main Japanese battle fleet. 2 American fleet carriers sent a total of 93 aircraft against these ships threatening the invasion force. The Shoho bore the brunt of the attacks, and although initially it was able to avoid the dive bomber attacks, it was eventually struck by 13 bombs and 7 torpedoes and sunk. The Americans lost 3 dive bombers in this attack to all causes, although they would take much heavier losses in the later stage of the battle. This battle was not really a good start for the Zuiho class. However, the Zuiho, the sole remaining ship in this class, would go on to have a very long career with the Japanese Navy, at least for an aircraft carrier in the Second World War. It repeated its Pearl Harbor role at the Battle of Midway. It first saw actual combat in the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, where it was supporting Japanese forces in the Solomon Islands along with the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. The Zuiho was damaged in this battle by 2 bombs and had to return to Japan, but its fighters performed admirably in disrupting the American attacks, and its bombers participated in the raids that would lead to the loss of the USS Hornet, which was a fairly major United States fleet carrier. The Zuiho was also present at the largest carrier battle in history, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, also known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. This was supposed to be the opening phase of the Great Decisive Battle, or Kantai Kessen, that the Japanese naval strategy between the wars had entirely been based upon. The plan for the opening stage of the battle was to use the longer range of Japanese aircraft to launch strikes on the US carriers at a distance where the US aircraft wouldn't be able to retaliate. However, the effectiveness of the American defences was terrible against the Japanese aircraft, inflicting catastrophic losses. To make matters worse, the Japanese were attacked by submarines and lost 2 carriers to submarines before losing a 3rd carrier to an extreme long-range attack by US bombers. So long-range, in fact, that 80 aircraft ran out of fuel before reaching their carriers on the return flight. This was about 75% of the losses that the Americans took in this battle. And that battle was really the last opportunity for the Japanese carrier aviation. Afterwards, they simply did not have planes or crew to be an effective force in the final year of the war. To give an idea of the problem, Zuiho's entire carrier division of 3 light carriers only had 11 aircraft between the 3 of them at the end of the battle. The Zuiho was eventually sunk while acting as a decoy in the Battle of the Leyte Gulf. The hope was that the Japanese battleships could get within firing range of the American fleet while the US carriers were busy attacking the Zuiho and the ships escorting it. The plan was partially successful. The US Navy located and attacked all the other Japanese fleets in the battle before they attacked the decoy force, which kind of defeats the purpose of being a decoy if everyone else gets attacked before you, but whatever. The plus side is that in the final stages of the battle, a significant force actually chased after the Zuiho and the other ships with it, which actually allowed a force of 4 battleships to get in close enough to engage US Navy escort carriers off Samar. It seems somewhat fitting that the Zuiho-class carriers were casualties in both the first and the final carrier-to-carrier battle in history. In World of Warships, the Zuiho is a powerful ship that is basically an upgraded Hosho, and the same tactics can be used effectively. The aircraft are much improved over the Hosho. The biggest improvement is the addition of a dive bomber squadron, which is actually a pretty decent improvement. While the bombs won't do a lot of damage, they are very good at starting fires, which can be used effectively with torpedo flooding damage. When stock, it gets 1 fighter, 1 torpedo bomber, and 2 dive bomber squadrons. It can get an upgraded loadout with 1 fighter, 2 torpedo bombers, and 1 dive bomber squadron. It's probably better to take the 2 dive bombers, but take the 2 torpedo bombers. Sorry, but taking 2 dive bombers isn't actually terrible either. The Zuiho is very powerful in regard to its defensive armament, particularly in terms of anti-aircraft defense. With the appropriate modifications and captain skills, the Zuiho can be the best anti-aircraft ship on most teams. The Zuiho gets 827mm guns for long-range AA fire, and when fully upgraded gets 30 of the 25mm Type 96 guns, which will actually devastate aircraft that come within 3 kilometers of your ship. When combined with range and rate of fire increasing captain skills and modifications, this becomes an absolutely unstoppable AA barrage at Tier 5. The 827mm guns also give an acceptable anti-destroyer defense. Just for comparison, it has the same number of guns on a broadside as does the Minakaze class destroyer at Tier 5, but the guns traverse 10 times faster and fire twice as fast and do slightly more damage per hit. However, the secondary armament is nowhere near as accurate as the destroyer's main armament. The big downside to the Zuiho's secondary armament is that they can't fire directly ahead or astern, which often means that you can avoid torpedoes or fire back at an attacking destroyer, but not both. However, they do have good firing arcs, and you can angle your ship fairly sharply and still fire your full broadside of secondary armaments at an attacking ship. To make up for that weakness, the Zuiho is actually very fast and manoeuvrable. It is relatively easy to dodge torpedoes in this ship, provided you were paying attention and you were kind of going at full speed. It also has the speed to relocate if it is in a dangerous position. The Zuiho was a very good ship for me. I had a 60% win rate in it over 45 games, doing 51,000 damage per game, shooting down 14.5 aircraft, and sinking 0.9 ships per game. At the moment, this is the third highest average damage of any ship I've played in the game. I only do more in the Hiryu and the Wyoming. My tactics in the Zuiho were basically the same as in the Hosho, but before I get into them, I'll talk a little about the different modifications for this aircraft. Basically, it's all kind of straightforward. There's one decision that you're going to have to make, which is to try to maximise your AA defences or maximise your fighters. I chose the first route, but both are viable options. Basically, this meant that I chose to extend the range of my AA guns by 20% instead of increasing the survivability of my fighters. The reason I did this was twofold. Firstly, the Zuiho can only put 4 fighters in the air at a time, so it will have the weakest fighter presence in the game, and while the fighter modifications will give you an edge over another Zuiho, they will not be enough to equalise the fight with the 6 to 12 fighters the bow can put up. The second reason is because the low number of aircraft that carriers have this tier, anti-aircraft fire can actually have a decisive impact on the game. But there are very few ships with decent anti-aircraft armament at tier 5. My strategy for winning air superiority directly follows from this choice. I would play my carrier aggressively. Essentially, I would put myself in a position where I was likely to be spotted, but not able to be shot at by enemy ships, at least hopefully not able to be shot at by enemy ships. About 3/4 of the time, this will be sufficient to tempt the enemy carrier to attack me. Once that happens, your job is to dodge the enemy torpedoes while using your fighters to pin down enemy aircraft in your AA fire zone. Make sure you concentrate your AA fire on a particular squadron, since this increases your damage per second by 50%. If you unlock advanced fire training and get the range increase modifications, this will extend your range out to 7.2 kilometers, so you'll have plenty of time to damage enemy aircraft. The priority here is actually enemy fighters. Once they are gone, your fighters will be able to essentially be free to disrupt enemy air attacks at will, and your bombers will also be free to attack whatever targets they want, without having to worry about fighters. If you haven't chosen to beef up your AA, or the enemy simply isn't attacking you, then I found the next best strategy was to play your fighters defensively. Focus on defending yourself and your allies, and try not to fight out of their AA cover. You'll most likely have the weakest fighter wing in the sky, so try not to fight if the situation isn't to your advantage. For this end, you actually only have to be attacking enemy bombers for a few seconds while they are actually dropping their bombs or torpedoes to disrupt their attack. This means it's best to attack the lead enemy squadron, but switch focus as soon as it has dropped its payload onto the next incoming enemy squadron. You won't get many kills except for on the final squadron, but you will disrupt all their attacks and really help out your allies. If you follow the strategy, the enemy fighters will have to come into your allies' AA fire to engage your fighters, which can be enough to even the odds in your favour. I should also mention that manual attacks and fighters are actually quite powerful in the current patch, so it is actually fairly useful to use them if the situation warrants. One of my favourite tricks that I've been doing a fair bit in the Hiryu, but didn't really do much in the Zuiho because manual fighter strafing wasn't that effective back when I was playing the Zuiho a lot. Anyway, one of my favourite tricks is when you see an enemy fighter squadron basically target your fighters, you run away, it chases you. Once you've got a bit of separation, because your fighters are faster, you'll then be able to turn around and do a strafing attack where you know they're basically going to be chasing after you, and you can get probably 3 to 4 kills just in a single pass, and then of course you can turn around and fight them regularly and hopefully finish them off. The third option for winning air superiority is to launch a strike against the enemy carrier. I'm actually not a fan of this strategy. The Zuiho does not have a lot of aircraft in reserve, and you are certain to take losses in engaging an enemy carrier. I also don't think you're likely to sink an enemy carrier in a single strike. An enemy Zuiho is quite capable of dodging most attacks, so you're unlikely to get more than a torpedo and a few bomb hits on it. The Bogue's a lot less agile, but still has enough combat capacity to take a few torpedo and bomb strikes. Most of the time I think you'd seriously damage the enemy, perhaps take away around half their health, but you'd probably lose about a quarter of your total aircraft, with a slightly smaller amount lost in the second strike to finish the enemy off. After which point you'd be struggling to put 8 torpedo bombers in the air, which kind of defeats the purpose of having gained air superiority. You will still have a lot of fighters left to go chasing after enemy scout planes though. In terms of attacking enemy ships, I continue to use the same 2 strategies I used in the Hosho, either staggered attacks or cross attacks. In staggered attacks, I would attack an enemy ship 1 squadron at a time in order to maximise the damage from fire and flooding. The disadvantage of this attack is that each of my squadrons bears the full force of enemy AA and fighter defences. Cross attacks, when I attacked with all my squadrons at the same time from multiple directions, almost guaranteeing that I'll get a few hits. The advantage is that only one of your squadrons will be fired upon. The disadvantage is that you probably won't be doing a lot of flooding or fire damage because they'll be able to repair it straight away and repair all of it straight away. A modification of the strategy, which I also used fairly often, was to launch a cross attack with your 2 torpedo bomber squadrons and then follow it up about 30 seconds later with your dive bomber squadron. If the torpedoes cause flooding and it has been put out, you'll end up doing a lot of fire damage. I'll finish by saying a bit about manual torpedo attacks. Firstly, the Japanese dive bomber manual attack is very powerful, and although I don't actually use it all that often, I really think I have to use it a lot more. When attacking a battleship-sized target, it generally moves me from scoring 1 to 2 hits to kind of 2 to 3 hits, maybe 4 if I'm lucky, and does a lot more damage and starts more fires. It also doesn't actually take a lot of practice to get right, at least on a not particularly agile target like a battleship. The manual torpedo attacks are a bit more complicated. They switched to the cone-shaped attack run 3 days before I made this review, so I didn't get much of an opportunity to test them out, but I think they could actually be really useful in the Zuiho, as well as the Hosho and the Ryujo. Those carriers do not have a lot of aircraft to spare, and the manual attack gives the Japanese torpedo bombers the option of launching at very long ranges, which will help a lot in attacking enemies with good AA armaments. I'm thinking in particular the Wyoming, which has a very good AA fire, but only very short AA gun range, which means that your aircraft, if they launch at the maximum range that your manual attack allows, and you get that nice tight cone at the end, they could do, get 4 torpedo hits if you aim well, and take very little anti-aircraft fire on the way in. So that's the advantage of those. The disadvantage of those long-range attacks is of course the time the enemy has to avoid the torpedoes. However, this could be mitigated to a small extent by launching manual cross attacks, which are actually possible. They require a bit of practice, but can be done. Basically, I think that being successful with this strategy will require a lot of practice though, and I think it's also going to be very situational in when you apply it, as in you're basically going to have to come across an enemy that you know is not going to manoeuvre, or it's in a situation where it can't manoeuvre, and you can accurately predict where it's going to be in 30 odd seconds or however long it's going to take for your torpedoes to arrive. Anyway, that's kind of enough about how to fight in this ship, so let's get talking about this gameplay you're seeing happening here. So I've just launched a cross attack on this enemy battleship. I botched it slightly by just delaying my second squadron arrived too long after my first squadron. Fortunately for me, the enemy battleship didn't attempt to avoid either of them, so I believe I got 2 torpedo hits there, or 3 torpedo hits possibly. I wasn't really paying attention at the start of this video. Now, the enemy torpedo bombers are coming in onto my friendly battleships, so I'm sent my fighters after them. And I'm attacking the lead squadron first. And nope, I've decided that actually this squadron is the lead one. It's going to come in first. So shoot down one of those aircraft, another one gets lost to anti-aircraft fire. But its torpedoes go wide and avoid my friendly battleship, so I disengage my fighters and send them after the other squadron. Unfortunately, they don't arrive in time to panic the crew of the second squadron, but my battleships are able to dodge all those torpedoes anyway. And now the torpedo bombers here are being absolutely wrecked by AA fire, and I managed to shoot down 2 more of them. which will put me up to 7 kills. And while that's happening, all my bombers have gone back to the aircraft carrier and have landed and are just starting to rearm and taking off. I actually tend to use my aircraft carrier as a staging point for the attacks and just leave my bombers circling above it while I wait for essentially all the aircraft to get in the air. Also saw there my allies' fighters engaging the enemy's fighters. I basically ignored it because my fighters weren't going to be able to get there in time. Unfortunately, aircraft at this tier are quite slow, so you really only have presence over a very small area of the battlefield in a given time period. So unless the enemy fighters happen to come to where you are, there's not a lot you can do about them. Now I'm pulling my fighters back. As I said, I tend to play defensively in this aircraft, at least play my fighters very defensively, simply because I know that I cannot beat enemy squadrons head on. And even against another Zuiho, there's a good chance that they've taken the increased fighter... Oh, I can't actually remember what the modification does now. I think it's increased fighter survivability modification, which I don't have, which means in a straight up fight I'd actually lose. But anyway, my bombers are all up in the air, so I'm launching another cross attack on an enemy battleship. I chose this one because it looks fairly isolated, and a lot of my attention in the Zuiho is actually going into conserving aircraft. It's basically, when you get to the end game, you want to have a decent strike force left, because that's when you become very important. Unfortunately, you're also very important at the start of the game, just try and get your team a bit of an edge. So far we haven't managed to do it. We've actually... losses on both sides are equal. Enemy teams actually probably positioned a bit better, in that they're all in one spot and they can cover their base from where they are. But my team's pushed up much more aggressively and is starting to put pressure on the enemy cap circle. My fighters come in to try and disrupt the enemy bombers here. And it looks like the enemy fighters are engaged over there, so I can actually get in. Unfortunately, I think I arrived just after the bombers dropped their bombs, but I'm able to attack these torpedo bombers, at least briefly before the enemy fighters turn onto me, and I have to effectively engage the fighters or I have no hope of surviving this one. While that's happening, my bombers have actually arrived above the aircraft carrier, and you see that's a better cross attack there. The battleship turns to port to avoid my first wave of torpedoes, and the second wave gets 3 hits there. And yeah, my fighters are going to lose this. It's currently 1 on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So yeah, we didn't survive that. We did manage to get 2 kills. Oh no, one of those was a bomber, so we got 1 kill there against enemy fighters. But as I said repeatedly, the Zuiho tends to have the weakest fighter wing in the sky on any particular battle. So you've really got to rely on your allies' AA guns or your allies' fighters to help you out. And now, well, I've actually run out of fighters completely in this match. You'll also look on the map. I've actually moved well up into the northern or the northeastern corner of the map, and I decided I'm actually going to start heading down towards the enemy cap circle now. Basically, I'm actually feeling kind of safe too because of where the enemy team is positioned, and I figure if I can actually push aggressively down towards where the enemy carriers are, my anti-aircraft guns can actually start intercepting enemy aircraft that are coming to attack the battleships that are kind of nearby me, the ones that are hanging back a bit, which I'm expecting will come under attack once the enemy kill this battleship that's in their cap circle. And basically I just want to get myself in a position where my anti-aircraft guns will be able to help my team out, since I don't have any fighters now. It doesn't quite work out that way, but it was a good thought, and my intentions were good. Just came to watch it. My allied bogey is a bit slow and the enemy's pushing on it, so it looks like this... I wasn't sure if this cruiser was doing it deliberately to try and speed the bogue up, but that seems to be the effect of it ramming it there. It turns off just then, so the bogue must have to keep going at its regular speed, which is painfully slow. Alright, bombers are almost up in the air. Go over see which of these battleships seem vulnerable, and the answer is they're actually all in a pretty tight group. Probably the one at the end is the most vulnerable, but it's also the least threat to my team. So I decided to target the lead ship on the inside there, just because I figure it's the one that's a combination of the easiest target to hit and also the most important to the enemy team at the moment. You can see we've got an allied cruiser in here with the enemy aircraft carriers, and it's keeping all the enemy aircraft occupied. So none of those aircraft actually came up towards the battleships like I assume they will, and one of the enemy carriers has been destroyed, and the second one's not going to last that much longer. And my aircraft are halfway towards the battleship that I ordered them to target. As I said, aircraft at this tier are quite slow. It's the other advantage of playing aggressively, is that your aircraft will get to your targets fairly quickly and will return fairly quickly, so you can launch more strikes. But we're almost there now, slowly trundling across, so I spend a bit of time readjusting the aim of these various attacks. It's not actually that great. Well, my dive bombers are coming in great here. I really should have done a manual attack here, but this was one of my first games in the Zuiho and I wasn't really all that keen on manual dive bomber attacks at the time. So I only get one hit, but it does start a fire. And the enemy's not foolish enough to put that fire out. And then I launch a cross attack from behind. And Squadron 4 here gets the hits because the battleship turns broadside onto it in order to avoid this fire from Squadron 3 here. So Squadron 4 gets, well, one hit, which is enough to sink it. A second torpedo hits its corpse. And then a third torpedo from the other squadron hits the already sinking battleship. So all in all, that was a pretty good strike. It's just a bit unnecessary. And now I'm actually leading the push here. I'm moving into the cap circle. Well, I was moving into the cap circle. But then I reckon my team got this game sorted. There's only 2 enemy battleships left. And I decide that I'm going to turn away from the cap and I'm going to sail around to this island where the enemy aircraft carriers were sunk. And basically just use my anti-aircraft guns to get a few basically free anti-aircraft kills. Which is kind of sad. I actually did get a fair bit of capture points in my Zuiho, but in this game I decided to avoid them just in exchange for getting some aircraft kills. As you see, I've only got 10 so far in this game, so this was a below average game for me in terms of aircraft kills, at least so far. I'm doing alright with torpedoes though, and 2 bombs was actually probably pretty good for me at this time since I didn't use manual attacks at all. You've only got 4 dive bombers in your squadron, so and it is actually quite easy for a dive bomber attack on at least on a cruiser sized target to get no hits. On a battleship sized target I'd expect to get 1 hit. In this game I think I've launched 3 dive bomber attacks and only got 2 hits from the 3 attacks, which, yeah, it's not great, but it is fairly typical if you're just using the automatic attacks on a dive bomber with dive bombers. Anyway, enemy aircraft are within the range of my long-range anti-aircraft guns, but unfortunately that Kuma has got there before me with its short-range anti-aircraft guns, so I don't think I actually get any kills here. Despite oh no, there we go, I got 1 kill. Let's see how many I do get, because I don't think I get many, despite sailing all the way and foregoing the capture points. Actually, it looks like just 1 kill. There aren't any more enemy aircraft on the minimap. So, I got 1 kill. Totally worth avoiding the cap circle for that. And now, of course, I'm going to have to sail all the way around this island to get back in it to get a few more points. And my aircraft are painfully slow, but this enemy battleship, the last one remaining, has a fair bit of health, so they might get there in time to launch their torpedoes or bombs. About a third of the way there now. And this is, like the Zuiho is a very powerful ship. It can do a lot of damage, and it can do it consistently with these cross attacks that I've been doing. Just get, 2 or 3 torpedo strikes per attack, and every torpedo will do 5,000 or so damage, so that's 10 to 15,000 damage per minute kind of thing, and a little bit more from the bombs. And if you do stagger your dive bomber attacks to come in later, they'll get a fair bit of fire damage, and it all adds up fairly quickly. But just the long flight time of the aircraft at this tier means that you can't really keep pressure on the enemy, and all you can do is kind of intervene basically every actually probably not even every minute, probably every couple of minutes, just intervene, hit one ship particularly hard, as I said, maybe doing 20,000 damage, and then come back in 2 minutes and hit another one in 20,000 damage, and hope that's enough to actually change the engagement in your favour. But in terms of being able to do that, it's actually very powerful, especially when you compare it to the Bogue. The Bogue, its tier 5 rival, is actually very good as an anti-aircraft ship, just because it can put 12 fighters in the air up against your 4, and 12 fighters from a Bogue will just make the game almost impossible for you. The first game I showed you was actually in that situation, and I lost all my fighters and almost all of my bombers by the time the game ended, but I did do a fair bit of damage. I think I did about 40,000 off the top of my head before that game ended, which I was actually pretty happy with considering what I was up against. But the Bogue really struggles to do damage to enemy ships. Actually, I should have looked this up before I started talking, but off the top of my head they can either have 2 fighters and 1 dive bomber squadron, and a single dive bomber squadron, its alpha damage isn't going to be very high. It'll get maybe 2,000 damage per strike, and probably won't do a lot of fire damage unless you're very lucky. And I think it also can get the option of foregoing a fighter squadron and bringing a torpedo bomber squadron again, which gives it a bit more power in the strike roll, but loses its big advantage in the anti-aircraft game. And having a single torpedo bomber squadron means that you can't actually do cross attacks like you see me doing here, and you have to do staggered attacks to be effective, which means your aircraft will take a lot more casualties through anti-aircraft fire and the like, which just makes the Bogue a very weak strike aircraft, and it also can't defend itself. Its anti-aircraft guns are good, but its manoeuvrability and speed are horrible, so it's kind of defenseless, kind of not good at attacking enemy ships. Its only thing going for it is that it's got good fighters. And against that you've got the Zuiho, which can defend itself against enemy aircraft. It can dodge torpedoes, it can dodge shell fire to an extent, it can retaliate against destroyers to an extent. It's got good torpedo bombers, which will give you quite a few options in how you attack enemy ships, and can do so fairly consistently. And the only real weakness of the Zuiho is that you only get 4 fighters, and you're basically going to have the weakest fighters in the game. But you can work around that weakness, and if you can do so successfully, the Zuiho has a lot going for it. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, or found it informative or interesting or useful, and I'll see you all next time.